Welcome back to the Nerdy Grail, and this is the second part in the 4-part series that I talked about, where I'm going to be talking about my top 10 best and worst episodes from the classic series, but also my best and worst episodes from the modern series, so going from 1963 to 1989 and 2005 to currently 2025. So in the last video, if you haven't checked that out, I did my top 10 best classic series stories. So check that out if you haven't already, because in this part, we are going to be checking out my top 10 worst classic series stories. Yeah, and again, remember, this is just my own personal opinion. Your list will probably differ to mine, and I would love to hear and see yours in the comments below. So behind me, I've got another set of my box sets. So I've got my Series 7 box set, the most recent in the collection range for Jon Pertwee, Season 15 for Tom Baker, Season 20 with Peter Davison, and Season 24 with Sylvester McCoy. So before I jump straight into the top 10, like last time I did 3 honourable mentions. So I'm going to do the same thing again right now, but this time it is 3 dishonourable mentions. So these are 3 stories that I'm also not a massive fan of, but they didn't quite make it into the top 10, and I think I could get some enjoyment out of them. So the first one that's going to go into my dishonourable mention is a William Hartnell story from Season 2 titled The Space Museum. Yeah, the Space Museum has a brilliant concept for a story. You know, the Doctor, Ian, Barbara and Vicky land on this planet where there's this museum that has loads of artifacts and stuff from different alien species, and it's really cool. And they discover that they are actually in the museum themselves, but they don't know how they got there. And basically the whole episode is them trying to find a way of not getting put into that museum for all eternity. Really cool concept. It's only a 4-part story, but the problem is the execution was poor and it really made the story drag out, which is why I'm not a huge fan of it and is why it's not a story that I revisit very often. The second honourable mention is actually another William Hartnell story from the season prior, so Season 1, and that is The Reign of Terror. Now this is another pure historical story. In particular, it focuses on the French Revolution and actually has 2 parts that are animated, which is really, really cool. And the animation is pretty decent. But the problem is, this was early Hartnell, this was the finale of Season 1, and the problem is it just drags an awful lot. Like, there's lots of scenes where you could have taken it out. The flow of the episode is not very natural, and that's the biggest problem with The Reign of Terror for me, which is why I don't revisit it very often either. And then this is the one that might shock some people, because I know this is quite a popular story, and it was for me as well. But the problem that I found is the more I've rewatched it, the more I've actually liked it less. So yeah, that's a problem. And it is a 7th Doctor story from Season 24 titled Dragonfire. Yes, Dragonfire, which is a companion departure and a companion arrival, and has a returning character as well. So this is the first story to feature Ace, played by Sophie Aldred. It's the departure of Mel, played by Bonnie Langford, and we see the return of Sabalon Glitz. I love Sabalon Glitz, fantastic character, but I think he's quite wasted in this story. It's a 3-part story, which is the one positive, but Glitz isn't the same. It feels very rushed for Mel's departure. Ace is brilliant, don't get me wrong, but also this is the story that has the ridiculous cliffhanger where the Doctor just jumps over the side of a ledge, climbs down on his umbrella, and then is like dangling from a cliff. And then in the very next part, it looks like he was quite close to the ground anyway, so it's really weird. But yeah, I don't know, there's just something about it that I've liked less and less as time's gone on. But those are my 3 dishonourable mentions. So now what we're going to do is we are going to jump straight in to my top 10 least favourite or worst classic series stories, in my personal opinion, starting with number 10. Coming in at number 10 is a 7th Doctor story from Season 26 titled Ghostlight. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Ghostlight. I've never been a huge fan of Ghostlight. The only reason that it's at number 10 is because there is a few saving graces for the story. Firstly, it's mercifully short as a 3-part story, so that's a good thing. But also, I must admit, the location footage, well, the location that it takes place in this big old manor house, and the atmosphere stroke the music that plays in this story is really good and really sets the vibe of the story really well. So that is a positive. The negatives come from the plot, which is very paper thin and very confusing, and all the side characters stroke the main villain of Light himself. He's very weird, very peculiar, doesn't click with me. I'm not really a huge fan. But this is another good aspect of seeing the Doctor be quite manipulative and, and controlling towards Ace as he brings her back to a place that she was terrified of as a child or as a teenager. So it really shows the dark side of Seven, which is another positive. But I just struggle to connect with this story, which is why it had to make it on the top 10 list for my least favourite Classic Who, because it's not one that I like to go back and rewatch. So that's why Ghostlight makes it onto the list, coming in at number 10. Number 9 is a Patrick Troughton story titled The Underwater Menace. And this is another one of multiple Atlantis stories that we have throughout Doctor Who's history. But yeah, I'm not a fan of The Underwater Menace. And this was originally one of the lost stories because we had 2 parts out of the 4 and then the other 2 were like recreations. But then obviously we got an animation version of it where they did redesign the core creatures and monsters from the episode, which I'm not a huge fan of the redesign. The animation's okay, but again, the plot's just all over the place, and it's really such a draggy episode in terms of the pacing is so off that you're constantly checking your watch the whole time. And to be honest, I've watched this story now 2 or 3 times, and I forget what happens because there's nothing that really sticks out to me, apart from the one professor guy who is absolutely insane. And he's about the only interesting thing in the episode because he's a bit of comic relief, so to speak. The animation, I suppose, saves it if you haven't watched it before, because the animation's not bad. But for the story overall, it's a bit boring, a bit dull, and the Atlantis thing, it's been done multiple times now. I know this is one of the first, but still. So that's why The Underwater Menace for me is on my list at number 9. So coming in at number 8, we have a 4th Doctor story from season 15 titled Underworld. And oh my goodness, this story, I recently rewatched this with my fiance and it was just as bad as I remember. It's not like terrible, but the problem is it's visually hard to watch to a degree because episodes 2 to 3, which takes place on this like planet in like this cave system, it all had to be filmed on blue screen so you can really notice how the characters stand out from the backdrops, and it's really distracting. There's even a couple of scenes on the spaceship scene from part 1 where you can actually see the green screen through the windows of the actual bridge itself, so it looks really bad. It's just a boring story, if I'm honest, and you'll notice that's a pattern with quite a lot of these stories. Is I'm not putting stories on the list that are so bad they're good. These are stories that are dull and boring and paper thin plots, and Leela and the Doctor's relationship in this is a bit here nor there. I don't know, it's just not really one that people come back to watch very often, and I know this is one that would probably make a few people's top 10 worst lists, because yeah, it's just shoddily put together, very dull, boring, not much going on, the villains are boring, the side characters aren't that engaging, and so for me personally, this is one of my least favourite Tom Baker stories, so it has to go onto my top 10 worst list, because I'm not going to watch it very often, so that's why it's up here at number 8. Number 7, we have an episode from season 7, John Pertwee's first season from 1970, titled The Ambassadors of Death. Now, this was my least favourite story from season 7. It's a 7-part story, which is far too long. It doesn't have enough proper core structure and interesting plot lines and plot threads and subplots to keep it going for a 7-part story. Literally, there's a part of the story where Liz Shaw gets captured. She escapes, gets recaptured again and again for about 2 or 3 episodes, and it is the same thing again and again and again. It's all about this space mission with these astronauts that went up into space, and they came back down and they were completely different. They weren't speaking, they were full of radiation, and people are trying to figure out what's going on. But then later in the story, we find out that that's not actually the astronauts that went up. They were kidnapped by this alien race. And there's sort of like this misunderstanding where they've taken our people and the aliens have taken, their people, vice versa. And so they got to try and trade and give them back to each other. But that doesn't need to go on for 7 parts. And also the story abruptly ends where the Doctor and co are just back at this space station. And they say, oh, just send them back up. They'll be fine. And then our astronauts will come down. I'm gonna go now. Bye, and then walks off, and then the episode ends. We don't actually get to see if they do come back alive, if they've been unharmed. It's just an abrupt ending to a story, and I'm like, if you're going to rush the ending, why did this need to be a long, drawn-out 7-parter when you could have probably fit everything you wanted to into a nice, neat little 4-parter? And I think that was the problem with some early Jon Pertwee stories. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Ambassadors of Death, and upon rewatch again, on the Blu-ray box set, it didn't really change my opinion of it. So unfortunately, that's why it's on my top 10 worst list. It's not one I'm going to come back to watch very often. Would I recommend it? Probably not. But hey, Jon Pertwee is still on top form, and I still like the Brigadier. But yeah, that's why it's on my least favourite list, coming in at number 7. Coming in at number 6, we have a 4th Doctor story from season 16, which is the Key to Time franchise, and this is the first in the Key to Time, titled The Ribos Operation, or The Ribos Operation. I can't remember how they pronounce it, to be honest. But what happens here is the Doctor has left Leela and K9 Mark 1 on Gallifrey, now has K9 Mark 2, and has been called upon from the White Guardian to track down these little segments of this great key that holds this great power, and whoever has that power can control the universe, this, that, and the other. A typical, mass weapon that needs to not fall into the wrong hands story arc, which is a good, plot for a season. It's just, unfortunately, it doesn't start off great. We get introduced to Mary Tamm's Romana 1, who a lot of people agree Romana 2, played by Lalla Ward, is better than Romana 1. I don't hate Romana 1, but I do prefer Romana 2, to be perfectly honest. I just don't think the chemistry between Tom Baker and Mary Tamm in this episode, or for most of the Key to Time, is very good. Romana 1 and the Doctor don't actually interact very much, and that's not very good for your protagonist characters, so you don't get that chemistry. And the whole plot of the first episode is very paper thin. I don't know whether it's just because it wanted to lead us in lightly into the Key to Time or what, but there's no standout moments for me from Key to Time 1 apart from the Doctor trying to get used to Romana's name. Obviously the infamous Fred line, that's about the only thing that stands out to me from this episode, and that's within the first 10 minutes. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of the Ribos Operation. I do like later episodes of Key to Time, but this is not one that stands out for me, and is, again, I hate to repeat myself, but it's another dull, boring, and paper-thin, plot-lined episode. And that is a theme going forward now. But yeah, unfortunately, that's why the Ribos Operation is on my worst list at number 6. So just breaking the top 5 in my worst list is a First Doctor story from Season 2 titled The Web Planet, and unfortunately this was the very first ever William Hartnell story that I watched, so I didn't have a great first impression for me to William Hartnell, it making the list and all. The problem is mostly the visuals and the pacing of this episode, because if you try to watch this both on the Blu-ray box set and on the DVD, visually there's this glare from I don't know whether it was a stylistic choice from the episode or whatever, but there's it almost feels like there's something wrong with your eyes when you watch it. It feels very blurred, and there's this shine effect to everything. It's really hard to watch and hurts. It actually hurts me to watch it, so it's why I don't go back to rewatching it. It's also got the curse of the Hartnell in terms of early Hartnells, and even some Troughtons had this. They would be 6 or 7 parts long and really didn't need to, so the pacing would be would come to a grinding halt, and that happens in this episode as well. It is a bit boring, I'm not going to lie. The First Doctor wears this really weird medical outfit to start the episode, and I don't know why. If I was to give it one little positive though, I will say that the Zabi and the Menoptera are really cool designed villains stroke aliens. They are quite cool, I will give them that. Nothing against those, even though they're basically just ants and butterflies stroke moths or whatever. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm not a huge fan of the Web Planet. It's too slow paced to me. The chemistry between the core cast isn't the greatest in this story either. But that's why, unfortunately, it makes it into my top 5 on my worst list, coming in at number 5. Now, at number 4, we have an episode from season 20. So, Peter Davison's second full season as the Doctor. It's the second in the Black Guardian trilogy, titled Terminus. Yeah, I'm not a fan of Terminus at all, to be honest. There's a few stories in season 20 that could have made it onto this list, but I wanted to try and be a bit kind, so the only one that makes it onto this list is Terminus. I am not a fan of Terminus at all. You know, I don't know, it's just something about it. It's also the departure story for Nyssa, and I really like Nyssa. You know, she technically has a decent send-off. Like, she does what her character would do, you know, staying on a planet in order to help heal people. So she does what she's meant to do. But it's just all the build-up beforehand, you know, where the Doctor and co are trapped on a leper ship, you know, full of people who are diseased and really ill, which could have been a great concept, but they just don't do much with it. And then they separate your core cast. So you've got the Doctor and Nyssa, and then you got Tegan and Turlo, sorry, who are like practically trapped in a vent for like all of the whole story. And this is a 4-part story. The Doctor and Nyssa and Tegan and Turlo don't interact with each other past the first 10-15 minutes of part 1 until right at the very end. And I'm like, well, that's not very good for our companion of Nyssa. She gets no interaction with our main characters. And also it makes half your core cast pointless, especially since this is supposed to be the arc where Turlo is supposed to be trying to kill the Doctor, you know, so it just makes that plot thread irrelevant as well. And just your supporting cast are not very good, you know, I don't know. It is just a waste, if I'm honest. It is a filler episode, which shouldn't be a filler episode in a core story arc like this, and for a companion departure, it really shouldn't be. So unfortunately for me, that's why Terminus is in the top 5 worst section on this list at number 4. So getting the bronze medal for my least favourite classic series story goes to another Peter Davison story, this time titled Time Flight. Yeah, you're probably not surprised that this one makes it onto the list, because this is usually considered quite low down on people's Peter Davison lists. Yeah, Time Flight is not a good story. The Doctor finally manages to get Nyssa and Tegan back to Heathrow, mainly Tegan, who's been complaining all season about getting home. But you've got to keep in mind that this story came off the back of Earthshock, where we just saw Adric die. So you'd think that that would play a big role in this story, and the companions and the Doctor would have to go through this big arc of trying to get over and mourn the loss of their beloved friend. But no, like literally about a minute into the episode, they're like, oh well, he's gone, he wouldn't want us to mourn. Anyway, we're at Heathrow, let's have fun. You know, and I'm like, that is insulting. I know Adric wasn't the most beloved companion, but still, in universe, you need to mourn, you need to be thinking about this, and this would play on them. But it just doesn't, and it's wrong. But yeah, they're at Heathrow Airport. Tegan finally thinks she's back, but there's this thing going on where these aeroplanes are going missing upon takeoff, and they have to investigate it. This is also the episode that has the Master in again, but in a bit of a debatably racist disguise, Khalid. It's a very peculiar one. I'm not sure what the choice was there or why they did that. It's not one of the Master's better disguises, put it that way, in terms of why he chose to be that. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Time Flight. You can tell the budget ran out at this point and they used it on previous stories, like, say, Earthshock and The Visitation and stuff. But, because yeah, it feels very cheap. But yeah, and also Tegan has a mini departure at the end where she just gets left behind and then gets picked up again in the very next story, next season. But yeah, I'm not a fan of Time Flight, if I'm being perfectly honest. It's not one I sit down and watch very often. So yeah, it deserves to be in my top 3 least favourite classic stories, taking the bronze medal at number 3. Just missing out on the gold medal, getting the silver medal, is a third Doctor story from season 9 titled The Mutants. Yeah, I am not a fan of The Mutants at all. In fact, I think it's literally probably been about 6 or 7 years since I've stuck it on, because it is just so boring. It is awful. It's one of the first stories in John Pertwee's era, not the first, but it's when obviously he was exiled to Earth and couldn't go into outer space without the Time Lord setting him a mission. That's exactly what happens here. The Doctor gets tasked to send a message and take this thing to this planet. And so Joe stows along with him to do this. But yeah, I don't know. It's a six-parter that doesn't need to be a six-parter. You can't really tell what the setting is of this story either. There's the spaceship, there's a cave, and then there's this marshlands where the people of the planet are slowly mutating into these creatures. Not that they realize it at the time. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to watch, hard to sit through. Nothing really happens. It's not John Pertwee and Katie Manning's best, if I'm perfectly honest. And yeah, I just personally wouldn't recommend this story. Definitely not as your first Third Doctor story. There's much better choices than this. I mean, I'd even recommend Ambassadors of Death over The Mutants. But yeah, it's not a memorable one. Especially when you're coming off the back of the Sea Devils prior, which is a really good story, might I add. So yeah, skip The Mutants. It's not worth your time, if I'm being perfectly honest. Unless you're like a completionist and you have to watch every story back to back in order, then maybe watch it. But maybe make like a bit of a drinking game out of it just to see if you can get some enjoyment out of it. Because I know that's probably what I'll do when I eventually sit down to maybe watch it again. But yeah, The Mutants for me, not a good story. So deserves to be second on this list, coming in at number 2. Getting the gold medal for my least favourite classic series story is another one from The Key to Time. Yes, this time it's the last story in The Key to Time, titled The Armageddon Factor. And oh my word, I have never been able to not watch a Doctor Who story more than once. Every single story in the classic series, even all the ones that have been on this list so far, I have watched at least a minimum of twice. There's at least minimum of a twice. Even my least favourite stories, so even The Mutants prior, I have watched more than once. I have not watched The Armageddon Factor more than once, because that was all I could sit through. This story, for me, has everything wrong with it. The settings are boring to look at, so not visually engaging. It's not a visually engaging story at all. It's a 6-part story, which drags like there's no tomorrow. This did not need to be a 6-parter. I do not know why it is a 6-parter. It's got a terrible end to The Key to Time. The ending is atrocious, because the whole point was the White Guardian sent the Doctor to collect these segments, put them together, so that they could be protected in one area, because if someone went around collecting them, then they could build the key, and then they'd have full control over time and rule the universe, this, that, and the other. Your typical bad guy things. But what happens at the end? The Doctor brings all the keys together, all the segments together, and then just disperses them again. So it's almost like, what was the actual point in The Key to Time? It made the whole series pointless if you're just going to separate them again. Don't really get it. Also, the one thing that I will say is interesting is they say that the last segment takes the form of a person this time. The Princess Astra, who is actually played by Lala Ward, actually, who then takes over as Romana for the following season. So that's quite an interesting little twist there. But yeah, you get to also find out that there's another person in this episode who used to go to school with the Doctor. So, and you get the first reference, or one of the few references in Classic Who, of him being known as Theta Sigma, which is, I don't know why that's in there. It's random. And that's the problem. It's also a random story as well. I don't understand it. It's not a good story. Your core cast are not on top form, if I'm being perfectly honest. I'm sorry to say. Like I said, it's visually rubbish, pacing's off, and then just ruins the whole plot thread. It makes the whole series pointless. You spent all this time collecting the key just for him to do what already was the case in episode 1. So it is a pointless series, if I'm honest. So that's why, for me, The Armageddon Factor is at number 1 on this list, because I've also not been able to stick it on more than once. It's the only classic story I've only watched once from start to finish, and that is not me. Anyone who knows me knows that I watch Doctor Who stories to death, even the ones that I hate. So, yeah, it's not a good story. I wouldn't recommend it. The only stories from Key to Time I'd recommend is Pirate Planet, Stones of Blood, and The Androids of Tara, if I'm perfectly honest. But that is going to be my list of my top 10 least favourite classic Doctor Who stories. I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, please like it by giving it a thumbs up and comment down below. What are your thoughts on the list? What are your personal least favourite classic Doctor Who stories? Because I'd be interested to know. And subscribe if you are new. So now that we've done the classic series, both the best and the worst list, I think we know where that means we're going from here. So in the third video in this little franchise that I'm doing, I will go over my top 10 favourite episodes from the modern era of the show. Yes, from 2005 with Christopher Eccleston to the current era with Ncuti Gatwa from 2025. So, this is the Nerdy Grail signing out for now. I hope you've had an amazing day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye for now, everyone.